Hello, everybody, and welcome back to environmental legislation. So this lecture today is going to be an introductory lecture, where I'm just going to kind of introduce the topic and kind of get you started, share with you guys a few of the basic founding principles in which this entire course is built around, essentially. Um, Environmental legislation is all about federal statutes that protect the environment, both public health as well as natural resources. And we'll talk about these fundamental underlying principles in the next few lectures and a little bit about the history of the environmental movement in the United States. Um, I mentioned before in the introductory videos that this will be essentially um, these little videos will be pretty short, pretty quick. I'm going to cover a lot of material in a short amount of time, but you can always pause it and go back through it. Not having the ability to discuss with you guys and kind of slow it down, I'm just going to zoom right through it. And it might seem a little bit boring staring at one slide for a couple minutes at a time, but I hope that you enjoy these little lectures and appreciate them and look forward to each one. So this one, I'm going to cover or discuss a little bit about the need for environmental protection. We'll go over the history, some of the historical problems associated with natural resource degradation and pollution. We'll talk about environmental legislation, which has emerged from these problems, and some success stories. Sometimes these environmental type courses like this can be a little bit depressing because everything seems to be in peril. But there are a lot of success stories where our efforts, particularly environmental statutes, environmental law, which is what this class is all about, the laws that protect public health and natural resources. And there's some success stories, but there's also a remaining need for balance, and we'll talk about that too in this lecture. Now, each one of these short lectures are only about 15 minutes long, so I can't get everything in each lecture. So this introduction will continue on through multiple little lectures, and then you'll see also chapter one, or excuse me, the Constitution, sources of law, and so forth. So there will be multiple lectures. I'll have them labeled, as you know, to identify what the topic is. So I want to first lay out this concept. First, imagine that you live in this little village up in the mountains. This is a Bavarian village in the Bavarian Alps. You have this beautiful landscape in which you live, in a little community gathered here in the center, and these meadows and these fields and so forth. And over time, you found that this landscape can be very productive for grazing sheep. We'll use sheep as an example. And particularly these meadows are very productive and provide great habitat for sheep. And you put sheep out there and they grow and they proliferate, and before you know it, you're making quite the profit. Well, let's go back here. Let's say other people in the village see grazing as a wonderful opportunity, in which it is, and there's nothing wrong with grazing. It's something that's necessary, and they keep putting their sheep out here on the meadows. And before you know it, you have lots and lots of sheep grazing in these mountain meadows. At some point, everybody begins to look out for their own self-interest, right? You get so many sheep out there in this meadow that the landscape begins to degrade, okay? There's just too many sheep. The landscape can't support this many sheep, and the landscape begins to degrade. However, each individual has their own self-interest. They need to survive. They need to pay the bills, they need to make a living, and they need to keep grazing sheep. So each individual doesn't necessarily see themselves as the problem, although they collectively are, each one of them, the problem, because they're looking out for their self-interests. In a perfect world, we would look out for each other, right? And we would strive not to overgraze the landscape and degrade the landscape as you see in these images, and we would have a nice balance of sheep, and we'd have a healthy environment. Unfortunately, and I'm oversimplifying this, things aren't quite this simple. But unfortunately, we tend not to look out so much for other people's self-interest because we're trying to survive as well. And we end up with a scenario where it could be a scenario of sheep, it could be harvesting timber, as you see here, it could be mining, it could be building roads, it could be building cities, it could be all sorts of different things. But we call this the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is this concept that emerged way back in Europe, where they had these common areas where you could graze your sheep and graze your cattle. And too many people were grazing their cattle and their sheep in these common areas. And I think even historically they had this problem in the Boston Commons way back in the 1800s, late 1700s, where people would bring their sheep and their cattle into the common area. And when you get too many in an area, we call this not sustainable, right? It's just this not unsustainable scenario. You get too many sheep in an ecosystem or an environment, in this case, um, and everybody's looking out for their self-interest rather than the interest of others. You have this problem where everything gets overgrazed. Now, the tragedy of the commons goes way beyond sheep and cows, and sometimes when I teach this class on the exam, everybody uses the sheep and the cow example. Well, overgrazing can certainly be an example of the tragedy of the commons. However, that's just the example I chose to share. But the tragedy of the commons can include so many things. Anything in which people are focusing on their own self-interest so much that collectively it's causing an ecosystem-wide problem, whether it's pollution or resource degradation. And all of this is considered the tragedy of the commons. This is an example, excuse me, of the North Atlantic cod. These fish used to be so abundant. Oh, I thought I had another picture. Were so abundant that the colonists used to harvest these by the hundreds of thousands, and there would be so many sitting on the docks that most of them would rot before they even got to the point that they could process these fish. They were that abundant. And it was even believed that the cod may have influenced the Vikings' trek across from Iceland and Greenland over to North America. It may have influenced other seafaring groups because they were so abundant, and the fish is worth so much, it's so valuable, and it's such a great resource. And if you know the story of this cod, they were overfished. At one point, they were considered one of the most abundant fish in the Atlantic. And today, they're highly managed and carefully managed because the population has crashed and is only beginning to recover. Here's another example. This is the passenger pigeon, once considered to be one of the most abundant birds in North America. They used to migrate in these huge flocks from, they'd migrate north to their nesting grounds and breeding grounds in the summer, and then back down south. And there's historical evidence that some of these flocks were so big that it would take 2 weeks for the entire flock to pass through an area. And they would land on the branches, and they would poop everywhere, and this would fertilize essentially the forests. And the people, the settlers, would shoot them and harvest them to consume them. And the strange thing is, the last passenger pigeon died in 1914. That was Martha. She's actually mounted. I think they kept her and mounted her in the Smithsonian. So the last passenger pigeon in existence in 1914. This was considered less than 50 years earlier, during the Civil War, to be the most abundant bird in North America, extinct by 1914 because they were over harvested. They were literally shot to extinction. That's the tragedy of the commons. Here's another example. The image up here of 1620 is an image of forested North America. All the green is forested. This is what was estimated to be forested in 1620. 1850, you can see where the settlements were. Massachusetts in the 1800s was actually primarily open habitat. It was deforested, which you can imagine. Colonists, settlers, they need to burn wood, they need to build their homes out of wood, and they need to clear the forests for agriculture. And so that's what they did in New England. These areas were highly cleared back in the 1800s. And by 1920, look at it. I mean, massive deforestation at a huge scale across particularly the eastern United States. A lot of the western United States is so remote up in the mountains, as you can imagine, and so hard to access that a lot of those forests remained, but not so much in the east. However, what I don't like about this image is it doesn't show you 2019. 2019 looks a lot more like this. Not quite. There's a lot of deforestation on the edges here around the large cities, but eastern forests in a large part are coming back because agriculture is not quite as pervasive as it used to be. Places like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, Pennsylvania, the forests are largely back. And today, most of Massachusetts, about 80% of the state, is forested. But this is an example of the tragedy of the commons, the self-interests of each individual trying to survive, as you can imagine. That was a tough life back in the 1800s and early 1900s. You had to survive. That's a real, the collective problem with that is massive deforestation. That is the tragedy of the commons. This is the Carolina parakeet. Carolina parakeet was also a fairly abundant bird. It was the northernmost parrot in the world, and this is their native range. The Carolina parakeet is now extinct. It was hunted to extinction. They were considered a pest because they would often fly into farmers' crops in large flocks and ravage the crops. They were hunted to extinction. Again, self-interests with a collective problem. Now, believe it or not, the turkey and all of its subspecies in North America were hunted nearly to extinction. And you include habitat loss into that. These birds were almost gone. Now, you've probably, I think everyone taking this class has probably seen a turkey within the last week. They're very abundant today. At one point, turkeys were considered so important that Benjamin Franklin, I believe, and this might be a myth, but this is what I heard, wanted the turkey to be the national emblem, the national bird, rather than the bald eagle, which would have been kind of interesting to see the turkey instead of the bald eagle as our emblem. But they were nearly wiped out. But today, quite a success story. They're back. But this is also the tragedy of the commons. So the reason why I'm sharing all these examples is because the tragedy of the commons is so much more than just overgrazing on a meadow. That's the example that came out of the first publication in the 60s from a man named Garrett Hardin. When he described the tragedy of the commons, he used that scenario of grazing in common areas in England. But the tragedy of the commons, this concept, represents all of these problems and many, many more. The example of overwhelming in the ocean caused catastrophic decline in our whales across the planet because they were hunted without any type of regulation or control, and they were vanishing very quickly. And it got so bad that in 1986 there was an international ban on whaling. And only I think Japan uses research as an exception to whaling, as well as some places like the Faroe Islands and native tribes that use whaling or still whale. They haven't accept an exemption, I guess, from that agreement to harvest whales at a small scale for cultural and what's the term? Not historical, but you're probably thinking of the term, but I can't. For purposes in which the tribes have, they've always done that, so they have an exemption. But pollution is also a problem. It's not just the decline of natural resources due to the tragedy of the commons, but also pollution. Now my time's about ready to run out, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and we'll pick it up right here, and then I'll try to wrap up this lecture on the next video.